Hey everybody, what's up? It's Sunday, February 27th. This is going to be an update for the week of earnings for AMC. So basically, I'm going to be doing a couple different kinds of videos this week. This one is going to be focused mostly on just the week ahead. And then the next video that I do will, I guess, be after earnings. So we'll kind of do like a recap of what happened. And then I'm going to talk about the future of AMC by the Friday video. I actually had done these macro and well, I did these macro ones a long time ago. I think the first time I posted about it was the iRobot video, but I have screenshots that go back to like January 24th or something, about a month ago, and it was something that I've been looking at for a while. Once I started piecing together like this particular kind of fractal and like trying to understand what makes up a quote unquote spring. And really, it's just the sequence that we have come to know and understand. If you've been following me for any length of time, I talk about it pretty much every single video. And my hypothesis has been for a long time that this is the first part. This is a cliff. There's going to be a bridge, and then we're going to have another part over here, which finishes. You can see here like this, right? It'd be a very similar motion, and then it's going to push up. Now, what would that look like? Well, a lot of people have been comparing it to this region over here because this is sort of like one half, right? This is one half over here. It's very long, extended. You can even see here the cat ear. This is a very long, flat cat ear. 1, 2, 3, 4 up thrusts, right? Remember that? But it's just super long, right? Really kind of boring. And this would be like your first spring, okay? And then this would be basically the second one occurs right here, and then the third one occurs over here, and then this will be the fourth one at the very end of all of this. And you might be saying, well, Booksy, if this is the fourth one, why would it need to go through all of this again in this particular region? Well, this is a super macro, all right? And each of these sections you can kind of break down into other macro springs. So I could break down this whole section right here into a macro spring section as well. And remember, the spring has on the left-hand side a full sequence, on the bottom a full sequence, and then on the right-hand side a full sequence. So it's like 1, 2, 3 different sequences. And then within that, you can break it down even further, right? And I'd been talking about this for a little while by when I was showing you these things, which is basically just saying like, yeah, it's actually in here like 10 different times. And really what we're talking about is the T1, the T2, and the T3. Each of them is in here, and each of these sections has all three. And the T3 is your spring fractal. It's important to understand this because if you understand the bones, like what makes it up, it's kind of like the DNA of the stock, right? That each one of these sections contains all three, you're less likely to get lost. And in the beginning, that was my biggest problem, right? Is like I would look at these and I would say, oh, I see them. And you only had one example. You know, you're looking at this stuff right here, and you might compare it to this region over here, like we were doing in the beginning. And then the sequence, and you're thinking that it's going to have the same result every time. Like every time the fractal is going to break up, right, when it gets to that T3, right? Which is why when we looked at May, and then we looked at this region over here in November, everybody was saying, oh, it's going to break up, it's going to break up. And really, frankly, it was just kind of short-sightedness. It wasn't completely wrong because there are times where, as you can see, where the spring breaks up. Several times where it breaks up. But it depends on kind of where you are in the sequencing. And we had already had, on the super macro, we already had like our big run. So on the super macro, I view that we're actually kind of in this region right here, okay? And we're finishing out this bottom, and we're going to push up, and it's going to look like, you know, the end of a bowl. See how there's one small one right here, the full sequence? See that? So you have the top, you have the bridge, you have the other side. You also have it here, right? So you kind of have to ignore this one. This is the setup one. But basically you have the bridge is right here, sometimes this section right here is lower, and this is the bridge, and then this is the other side. All right, and then it drops. So again, one on top, one full one on the bottom, one full one over here. Each of those is complete. What's odd is that, of course, when you're looking at these things, you have to sort of take it in stride that they are layered. There's not just one layer. So while we have a super macro spring here, where this is basically the bridge, and this is what led us out of the bridge, okay, that makes sense as why this being the spring number 3, as what I usually call it, like the major spring 3. So this would have been spring 2. This would have been spring 3. Both of these are pretty big. And spring 3 is the one that gives you the markup. So on the macro time frame, just looking at where we are currently, and this is just a recap, we're looking at this is probably going to be this setup down here. Whole setup down here is going to be considered spring 2 when we look back at it. And oddly, spring 1 is actually back here. That run we had to 52, which was a very big run if you remember. But then we set up these cat ears, we dropped down, and then we need a spring 2 that's going to propel us up. So that would be like basically we just had it. It was at 30% run, but in retrospect, we're probably going to see another kind of big move like that, and everyone will say like that's the whole region. We could look at that whole region down here as like spring number 2. But to me, like I guess technically speaking, spring 2 is the turning point, and then spring 3, boom, that's the one that gets you out of that region. So we are going to see something that sets up a lot like a T3, and that's going to make a lot of people feel like, well, this sequencing here was correct. And they're not wrong in that assessment because it is the same. Like you can see that each one of these has the same parts. The difference is that we know that we're tracking multiple time frames. So the expectation is going to be that after you get that spring number 3, that you're going to have this major push up, right? And everyone's going to be thinking it's going to look a lot like this. And while that is a possibility that it will push pretty hard and pretty far, we also have to keep in mind that what results in at the end will be this kind of emotion. If we're right, if we're correct, if I'm right about the super macro, right? Not talking about macro, because in the macro view, we're just going to see this kind of stuff. But again, you can take all of this right here, okay, and nest it again over here. So if you were to grab everything from this point to this point, from Mark 6 all the way down to Mark 10, it would also fit from in all of Mark 9 and 10. Does it make sense? Like from this point forward. And that is what makes AMC stock, and really more or less Mark 8, because Mark 8 is where the turning point happens, right here. You get what I'm saying? That's what makes this stock so much fun and so frustrating at the same time. So later in the week, I'm going to break down some different options for how I see this playing out. I have 3 now. I used to only have the bullish and the bearish, but upon further studying the stock, I actually think it's more likely that we're going to see sort of a 2-parter, that we're going to see that this thing right here, when it breaks up and completes on the short term, more like the macro view here, I think it's going to be actually in this pocket right above or right on this pink line. And then it's going to break out, and that's going to be the super macro. And on the super macro, I think you're going to get another setup. I know it's kind of confusing. But on the super macro, it'll look like we just did. Remember, on the super macro, it's going to look like we just did this region right here. And so we're actually going to get a whole nother section. And I think it's possible, and we'll see what happens. It's possible, like I'm wrong about all of it, but I think that's where things are going to get tricky, because I think then you're going to have to look at, the best way to do it is just to look at different time frames. I'm going to do that later this week. So put a pin in it, and we will come back to that. Don't stress about it. I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible. I've already charted all the different time frames, so I'm ready. I'm just trying to find a best way to present that as we kind of close out this week and close out the sort of the constant updates for AMC on this channel. But basically, let's just talk about the week ahead. So one thing I'd been talking about recently were these iterations where you get these shrinking fractals. And I talked about one here that shrunk down to here, and then it shrunk again to here. And I called this as a spring because I said, well, look, it's iterating down, it's shrinking, right? And I had folks that were, of course, saying like, well, yeah, we know it repeats. Well, no, it does repeat. The sequence always repeats, and it will continue to repeat, right, until it doesn't. But the key here, the kicker here, is that I know you're looking at this like worried. Don't worry about it. Okay, I'm going to explain what I think is a possibility. It's not a definite outcome, all right? But there's a reason why this is a strong possibility right now, and I'll get to that. I also called it here. I said, I saw this as a repeating down as well. And I called this little spring as well. And it was really, I posted about it on Twitter. I posted some handy dandy screenshots that I can share if you want. And I will put them in that folder. But basically, each of these was a spring action, but it had a different kind of setup. This one was repeating this basic top. This one was repeating this basic top. So it's interesting because during a spring, you see the same pattern inside that spring repeating, if that makes sense. So like during an iteration that's going down into like a singularity, and a singularity, if you don't know, black hole, it's like everything comes to a point, right? So it's like funneling down to a microscopic level. The same thing happens with fractals, typically before a spring action. There have been a couple times where it's done it. One time, namely, it did it over here, and it never returned. It never came back to that level. It pocketed it. And I've been talking about that 32 for a while because it just left it and it broke down. And the reason it did that is because, and it also did it right here. And both of these are the same spot on the fractal. They're both right before the bridge. So this is right before the macro bridge. This is right before this little micro bridge. And then you might be looking at this saying, well, why did this one break down? Again, it was following this macro pattern. And this is really important because in all the cases where you have a spring that doesn't go, it's always the same. And I'm gonna show you what I'm talking about in a few minutes. But basically here, what I notice is that this patterning is the same. This, and then I would expect to have at least one more, maybe even two more as it gets smaller and smaller. So as you can see, even though maybe immediately it doesn't look like they're identical, it's a pretty strong comparison. If you were to go to the 15-minute chart, you can see here that this pattern does look a lot like this pattern, albeit not exactly the same. And perhaps you'd even say like, well, maybe it's this or something. The reason why I'm including this bottom like I did is because you can see this sort of a W pattern where the middle is the bottom of the spring. The same thing occurs down here. So that's what I'm looking at primarily. And then it iterates, right, into a spring action that shoots you up, just like it did here. Middle spring is the bridge, and then it iterates into the final spring action, which shoots you up. The same as that diagram we were looking at before. All right, that's a normal spring. So this tiny spring right here finished. But you have to keep in mind that we're also in like a larger sequence here. And this whole thing is going to form a full spring that ends here. Remember? So this is where things get kind of tricky. But remember, this is all the bottom. And I said before, there's two springs here and there's a whole sequence down here. All right, you could count the whole sequence. So you start with a spring and you end with a spring. And really there's one more in the middle, which is the bridge. So if you remember, last week I said, I think that on this particular time frame, just looking at this midterm, right, from basically the mid-January to now, I think we're just forming the bottom here. And that means that this particular action, we've got the double up thrust here, right there. There it is. All right, you can see this would be the first spring bottom. We got the double up thrust. And we're coming down and we're forming this sort of a double tap. Now this essentially, all right, to put it really short, is also a bridge. It's just a smaller bridge. So that means that the expectation would be that as we come down through here, all right, now you might be saying, well, Booksy, is it possible that this is already over? And the answer is yeah, because you see how it's already come below, okay? It's already come below that particular level, which is really all that's necessary. And if we were drawing this on like a curve, we might even say that, yeah, like it's done, right? It's already gone below, and then this is forming like the bottom right here. So if that's the case, though, look at this. All right, on a smaller time frame, this is the double upthrust on the smaller one. Do you see this? Double upthrust. So what happens after the double upthrust on the smaller time frame? We get another sell off into another spring bottom, just like this. So again, you would see a copy. So there's two confirmations that this is probable. Doesn't have to happen, but it's probable. You might be saying, well, Booksy, what if that's the double upthrust? What if you know, this is already the bottom and we're just going to see this and then a push up. So maybe a quick pullback and then a push up. That's also a possibility. That's a more bullish scenario. Okay. The difficult thing about this, and it's always been the case with the fractals, is that you have to sort of give yourself room to be a little bit wrong sometimes, because it's hard to see if this is like, is this the double upthrust, right? Like, did we already get this motion, right, that pushes us out, and then this has already formed a double upthrust with a double bottom, and we're already like here, and we just need to kind of have a quick drop down to maybe this level, the 17 level, and then push out. So I want you to keep in mind that that is a possibility, okay, that we could end up seeing just this 17 level and then push out. But the only reason that's a possibility is because it is possible that this is just running up sideways really hard, and that we've already gotten the double top. However, if I'm just looking at this based on what I see here as a comparison, do you see how this has like the double up thrust here that kind of shapes sideways volcano? It's right there. We come down, we get this sort of bigger double bottom. There's a smaller double bottom. It's not really a double bottom, right? It's just coasting down. We get that double bottom here, and it kind of goes upward, which is good. All right, it's following the momentum of these arcs, which is great. But as we saw over here, remember when this one did the same thing, it iterated this pattern that was on the left-hand side here. It ran up and then it dropped and then it did it again. So we would expect that as it's doing the same thing here, that it's running up and then it would probably drop again. And when it finally does break out, it's because it's super tiny. You can see it did drop one more time. It's microscopic almost, and then it finally goes. We're not at that point yet, and that's why I'm not really sure. I'm not willing to say like, oh, it's got to go, because I don't think it does. I think that we haven't gotten to that kind of microscopic iteration yet. So I'm seeing it as sort of we just got this double top, more than likely, or we're about to. So like this push up here could be just this initial push up from the base of the spring. All right, we're going to come down. We get this kind of a bounce. We're going to form, perhaps, at this point, we're going to push up. Maybe we do push up, right? First thing, and then we come out sideways. That's a possibility. Another possibility is that, again, this is sort of already this section, and we're just going to go sideways a bit and then drop. I think the case for that might be that if we were to push up, it kind of doesn't make a lot of sense of this initial motion. Normally, if you look here, this coasts downward. It doesn't come as high, and that's true on all the levels, like all the time frames. If you look at this, what this one did, it did the same thing. Like it came up higher, and then the second and the third push didn't come up as high. So this came up higher, the second and third push don't come up as high. So if this is the height, then this is why I'm kind of like, I don't really think it's necessarily going to come up any higher than what I just did. We'll see. If it breaks here and it does push up again, perhaps, we're seeing this motion and we're going to get a longer, more drawn out thing. But just based on the size of everything. I just have to make a best guess, so that's what I'm doing. Um, so just to go to another chart and just show this a different way, I wanted to talk about this chart for a bit. So I was looking back and I thought, well, if it's iterating down, then perhaps it's been doing that this whole time. And sure enough, it is. Um, Now, at first, you might say, Booksy, I don't really think that that's correct. And it could be that this is more or less over here, but I actually think this is just super compressed. You see how there's this like foretop, then it drops, there's the foretop, and then it drops. So it's within, and this is kind of a bowl shape. There is a double up thrust here, it's just really small, has a dip, and there's so this would be like your cat ear right here. Okay, so it is correct. And here's where this kind of meshes with what we saw on this chart right here. Oopsie. A little bit better. I'm going to flip back and forth some. Remember that during a replicant spring, as I call it, you get this kind of the same 1, 2, 3, but then what happens is that when it breaks down and comes back up, this hook fails and it drops. So same thing happens here. It breaks down, comes back up, hook fails, and it drops. Same thing right here. Breakdown, comes back up, the hook fails, and it drops. Every time you have a replicant spring, okay, it does that. And even in smaller cases, like really small cases, you can't see it, right? But this one had the same thing. It came down, it hooks, and then it drops, right? And I can't see it on this chart. So if you notice here, that's not the chart I was on. Every time it came down and hooked, right, it dropped and it would form the cat ear and then it would move forward. Now, in this case, I have some problems maybe charting it. And you could look at this and say, Booksy, clearly that's like supposed to be like this. Perhaps, I don't really think it matters too much. Both of these work, but I think you can see clearly like the hook a little more clearly on this one. So it might be better to draw it that way just to visually see it better. Same thing with this. You could draw this more or less like that, right? And you can see the hook a little better. The point is that it fails to break out above these lines, all right, from the previous spring. So I did that throughout here, and you can see that each time it does the same thing, and it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And this is very small, but it's not microscopic just yet. So from this point, you might be saying, so what would you expect to see? Well, if you want to do a bars pattern, you can just take it from the hook, right? And go to basically the end of the sequence. Really, the way I drew this a little off. We want this to be at like the height. There we go. So you can do it from where the hook hits to the end of the sequence, shrink it down. And then you sort of have to look at, all right, well, what are the rules, right? Like what is the expectation of what might happen here? And is this just going to keep happening? Well, kind of, right? So at this point, we're missing what part? Well, we're missing this part, this middle part. So we would need to do it again with the middle part. There you go. And you can see that when you do it this way, it looks a little bit more or less the same. It's just overlaid differently. So at what point, though, is this finally going to stop doing it? Well, it's not going to go down forever. I think at this point, we're talking about it staying up. It's a little M shape, right? Because you see how every time it's done this, recently, it's actually come up, which is good, which makes sense to a degree. Here, it's been breaking down. But you see how this platform is sort of where the spring is? This is also true over here. The spring, excuse me, if you look right here, see this platform? It matches, right, opposite this region. And I think the little bowl that's created. So I think that using that, you can do a pretty decent estimation. There's the platform, there's a little bowl. Right. So this one's kind of hard to do, but basically, it would have to be like the same thing each time. And it doesn't come down as far. Each time lately it's come down. This one came down to sort of the previous floor here, not where the spring is, but the floor. So there's the floor, not the spring, but the floor. So you would do that each time. So I said on Twitter, I said maybe that blood stake region, which is like 15 to 16. It really was 1550 originally. It was that marker over here, right around 1550. But we saw that over the course of time, it actually was kind of like this huge pocket here. And I think that's a very reasonable estimation for where we might touch down before earnings. And earnings is on the 2nd. So the way that I drew this, you can see it's like, oh, well, that's way over there. That doesn't look like it would work out. Sure. And it's possible that we iterate really fast and we run up into earnings. But and again, there was the other option of it kind of setting up higher. But basically I just looked at possibilities. Okay. These are possible gap down targets. Not really looking for that. I'm just thinking that's a possibility. Each of these orange lines is a possibility. Even this one, which seems to go really far down, is a possibility. I'm not saying it's the most likely. And basically, I just looked at this and I said, okay, well, let's pretend that there's a few different options. So let's just look at the slow path, the simple path. So the slow path is just that it just drags on, right? Like it takes all week. We get basically this sideways action on Monday, and then it starts falling down, and then we basically just go down into earnings. It could even be sort of really like boring, stair stepping basically. And then when it finally does drop, we basically end on the low on that blood stake level. For the simple path, this is one that I just kind of looked at the timing of it and tried to estimate like, all right, well, if I were going, just to play it more evenly, it's possible that we get to this point, the bounce before earnings, and then earnings ends right before the next one sets up. And that was sort of the way that I had drawn it more or less over here, but stretched out. And then there's sort of like a rapid path, which means that you iterate very quickly. And this is the one that is the most scaling wise could be the most valid, but that's very rarely what happens. And then there's 2-3 iterations before we finally break out. And granted, at this point, you're talking about barcoding. I mean, you wouldn't really see it. But this would be like to shrinking down, right? This would also make some sense in terms of a sort of a, look at that, it's almost perfect. I didn't do that on purpose, but a sort of like a wedge, okay? If you wanted a larger wedge, then you would probably use, again, this line, this orange line. And that's maybe the reason why you might favor this actually going down more, right? So instead of kind of bouncing off this center line here, you actually set up perhaps below it. So that would be a very, not bearish, but it's a possibility. So you set up down here, right? And that's where you get that final touch on that line. It kind of breaks some of the rules that I just talked about, but it would be more like this. Okay. But yeah, that's a possibility for sure. And then you're saying, well, what do you think is the most likely? Well, the most likely thing in my mind is sort of a middle of the road approach. I really don't think that we run up into earnings. If we broke out here and just, again, headed up, I still think you're going to see the same iteration play out. If it happens that way, maybe it would play out higher, but I still think you're going to see this kind of action into earnings. And I can't see us being above this particular line right here because this essentially represents that hook, right? And if they want to sort of conceal the hand, or more like that, if they want to conceal the hand, so to speak, then you would do it here. Like you wouldn't do it you would do it before earnings. Okay. You wouldn't want to start running it up into earnings and after have it basically still just keep running, like as if earnings was already priced in. Like I think they're always going to set it up in a way that they can drop it or rise it, but they're going to basically have it at the end of a sequence. And that's why every way I drew it, it's already at the end of a sequence. It's just um one way draws it out so it's long, it's slower, it only does one sequence. Um and those are another ways it does too. Um and then the severity of the drops kind of vary. I'm just doing it based on, okay, this drop only came to this point, so this drop may only come to this point, and it might create, this kind of a wedge structure in the end, and that's again very likely. There's other lines here that could be drawn, so it wouldn't surprise me if that happened. Yeah, I like that too. Kind of works. Anyways, so that's what I've got for the week. I really think that we're going to finish this iteration. I think it fits just fine, into the macro view. I think if you look at the macro view, we see that there is kind of a bounce here and then a drop. I did pull up. Oops. I'm starting to organize my charts. Yeah, if you look at this region, do you see how there's this? It's very similar. There would be the bottom spring. This would be the flat root zone. Here's what we just saw, right, on our bottom, right? And then this is that push up that we just experienced. Everyone's like, oh no, it's going into earnings. And then it has the second thing. It looks just like this. And then it drops down. Then it runs. So it does match where I think we are in the fractal pattern. So it's not like completely out of left field. And the fact that we've got this macro iteration that's going on makes me think that this is very likely. And then also afterwards, we see a nice big run. So that's all I got. Hope you all have a good one, and I'll talk to you later this week.